thought the war was finally behind him, until a quiet afternoon in Oak Ridge shattered when a violent biker gang stormed into a small diner to intimidate an old man, a father who had already lost his son on the battlefield. What they didn't know was that the man sitting in the corner, quietly drinking his black coffee with his German Shepherd Rex at his feet, was the very veteran who held that son in his final moments. And when the bikers grabbed the old man by the collar, a long-kept promise came alive again. Jim Walker stood up. Rex growled low, and the entire town of Oak Ridge was about to witness the weight of a promise between soldiers. What happened next stunned everyone, and it all began in that single moment. October settled over Oak Ridge like a cold blanket, carrying the scent of pine, wet soil, and early winter wind sweeping through the narrow mountain town. Wooden cabins pressed together beneath the gray sky, their roofs glistening faintly with the threat of rain. Jim Walker, a 50-year-old American veteran with a broad, battle-seasoned frame and short graying hair, drove his faded blue pickup slowly through the chilled air. His angular face, marked by faint scars, reflected a life that had been anything but gentle. Beside him sat Rex, a 4-year-old German Shepherd with a strong build and alert amber eyes, scanning every shadow as if the world itself might shift at any moment. Jim had spent months drifting across the Pacific Northwest, studying towns that promised peace, but offered only the echo of a normal life. Oak Ridge felt different. The stillness didn't make him restless, it made him aware. Rex adjusted his posture, ears twitching as the wind rattled a street sign. The dog was more than a companion. He was a living reminder of discipline, loyalty, and survival. Jim reached over and scratched behind Rex's ear. "Almost there, boy." Rex only blinked, steady and loyal, as if he already knew why they had come. The truck rolled to a stop in front of a modest wooden diner with a faded green sign that read, "Pinewood Diner." Its warm yellow lights spilled through the windows onto the damp sidewalk, creating a pocket of comfort in the cold afternoon. Jim sat quietly for a moment after cutting the engine, feeling his breath fog in the chilled interior of the truck. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't thirsty. He was answering a call that had lived in his bones for a decade. Rex hopped down first, paws landing softly, then waited for Jim before padding toward the entrance across the leaf-swept pavement. Inside, the diner smelled of warm bread, maple syrup, and the lingering trace of a lunch rush long since past. Wooden booths lined the walls, worn smooth by years of patrons seeking simple meals and simpler moments. Behind the counter, wiping down a table with slow, practiced movements, stood an elderly man with snow-white hair and a thin, stooped frame. This was Raymond Fisher, a 68-year-old widower whose gentle blue eyes spoke of kindness and sorrow in equal measure. He wore a red flannel shirt tucked neatly into faded jeans, and though his hands trembled slightly with age, his work was precise. When the door chimed, Raymond looked up, first noticing Rex with a soft smile. "That's a fine-looking dog you've got there," he said warmly, his voice gravelly but welcoming. Jim stepped in, removing his gloves, offering a small nod. "Name's Jim Walker," he replied simply. Raymond acknowledged him with a polite nod, not recognizing the name or the weight it carried. Jim ordered a coffee and chose a seat near the window where he could observe the diner, and the man he had come for. Rex lay down by Jim's boots, tail curled neatly around his paws, eyes alert. Jim watched Raymond move with quiet determination, clearing tables and setting out silverware with a dedication that felt heavier than routine. The old man had lost his son, Michael Fisher, in Afghanistan. Jim remembered Michael vividly, a young soldier with sandy hair, a sharp jawline, and a smile that somehow survived even the worst days. Michael had been fearless without being reckless, kind without being soft, and stubborn enough to get himself into trouble, but always brave enough to get others out. Jim could still hear the man's laughter echoing against concrete walls and desert winds, but the memory that lived closest to Jim's heart was the day everything went wrong. He remembered the dust storm swirling like a living beast, shots cracking through the air, Michael falling with a suddenness that froze the world. Jim had held him, pressing down on the wound, refusing to accept the life slipping through his fingers. He remembered the tremor in Michael's voice, the steady courage despite the pain, and the final whisper, "If my dad ever needs help, promise me you'll be there." That promise had followed Jim across continents, through sleepless nights, into Oak Ridge today. Raymond brought the coffee to Jim's table with both hands, setting it down gently. "Hope you're staying warm out there," he said with a fatherly kindness that struck Jim unexpectedly deep. "Winter comes early in these mountains." Jim nodded, noticing the stiffness in Raymond's movements, the tiredness hidden beneath his steady demeanor. "Seems that way," Jim replied. He wanted to say more, to tell Raymond everything, but the weight of the truth demanded patience. Some revelations needed a proper moment, not a rushed confession between sips of coffee. Throughout the afternoon, a few locals entered the diner, friendly-faced townspeople who knew Raymond well. Jim listened quietly as they chatted. Stories about Raymond fixing a neighbor's porch despite his aching back, bringing pies to the fire station, refusing to close the diner even when business was slow. Raymond wasn't just a man living alone in a quiet town. He was a thread holding small parts of the community together. Watching him now, Jim understood with painful clarity why Michael had fought so fiercely to survive. He had wanted to go home to this man. As dusk settled over the mountains and the diner prepared to close, Jim finally stood, feeling Rex rise beside him. He approached Raymond with a firmness softened by empathy. The old man was counting bills from the register, squinting slightly at the faded numbers. "Mr. Fisher," Jim said quietly. Raymond looked up, polite but curious. Jim took a breath, steadying himself. "I knew your son, Michael Fisher." The name hung in the air like a held breath. Raymond's hands froze, his eyes widening with a mix of pain and longing. Jim continued gently. "He was brave. He saved lives. And before he passed, he asked me to watch over you." Emotion shimmered in Raymond's lined face. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and inside, Jim felt the weight of a decade-old promise settling into place. In that moment, he understood. He hadn't come to Oak Ridge searching for peace. He had come to honor a debt that would never truly be paid, but one he would carry willingly. The late afternoon sky over Oak Ridge had darkened into a bruised shade of blue by the time the smell of frying onions and warm pastries filled Pinewood Diner. Jim Walker sat quietly at his table, sipping his coffee. His broad shoulders relaxed, but his senses sharpened. The familiar weight of his military, cold-weather parka settled around him, its thick fabric insulating him from the draft that seeped through the diner's old window frames. Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd with a sturdy frame and keen amber eyes, rested at Jim's boots, calm but alert. Outside, the wind scraped dead leaves across the pavement, a soft warning carried on the cold. Inside, the diner vibrated with a stillness that felt almost predictive, as if the town itself held its breath. The peace shattered when the door banged open with a violent clatter. A wave of cold air swept through the diner, followed by the heavy footsteps of 6 men dressed in dark leather. They moved as a unit, loud, swaggering, radiating the kind of confidence born from intimidation. The patches on their vests marked them as members of the Steel Vipers, a biker gang known across Oregon's backroads for extortion, stolen goods, and public threats. Leading them was Kane Mercer, a tall, broad man in his early 40s with tattoo sleeves crawling up both arms. His square jaw was shadowed with rough stubble, and his dark, sharp eyes carried a predator's cold stillness. Behind him trailed 5 other bikers, each rougher than the last, with grease-stained hair, scarred knuckles, and the kind of arrogance that thrived on fear. Kane approached the counter, trailing the scent of gasoline and cold metal. His boots thudded against the wooden floor with deliberate volume, as if each step was a declaration of control. Raymond Fisher straightened, his thin frame trembling slightly. The elderly man's red flannel shirt looked small beneath Kane's towering figure. "Quaint little place," Kane murmured, brushing his tattooed fingers across the countertop before slamming his palm down hard enough to make the napkin holder jump. "This diner sits on Steel Viper's territory now. From today, old man, you'll pay $600 a week to stay protected." His voice, low and gravelly, carried no warmth, only threat. Raymond's hand tightened around a coffee mug, the ceramic rattling against the saucer. Raymond tried to speak, his voice cracking slightly. I'm just an old man selling pastries and soup," he said, attempting a frail smile. His pale blue eyes darted between the men, searching for even a sliver of mercy. But the bikers only smirked. One of them, a lanky man with a crooked nose and a scar slicing through his eyebrow, leaned closer and tapped Raymond's shoulder mockingly. His biker vest looked worn, and his uneven stubble hinted at a man who rarely cared for social presentation. "Doesn't matter," he said, grinning. "Old or not, rules are rules." The mug tilted, nearly slipping from Raymond's trembling fingers. The moment felt frozen, quiet enough for Rex's soft growl to rumble like distant thunder under the counter. Jim rose from his seat, his boots scraping gently against the floor. The motion was neither rushed nor forced. It was the controlled, steady movement of someone who had spent years mastering the art of measured action. His 6-foot frame cast a long shadow across the diner floor, and the thick parka embraced his muscular form like armor. "He's not paying you," Jim said calmly, his deep voice carrying across the space with sharp clarity. Kane's head turned, his cold eyes narrowing as he sized Jim up. The corner of his mouth lifted into a mocking half-smile. Kane's men shifted, their posture tightening. Rex stepped forward, his thick black and tan coat bristling, his teeth slightly exposed in a low warning. Kane tilted his head toward Jim, amused. "And who might you be?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. He rested both hands on the counter, the tattoos snaking across his knuckles catching the dim diner light. The air around the 2 men grew stiff, like a drawn bowstring. Jim's eyes did not waver. The lines on his face deepened from years of leadership and responsibility, the kind that carved strength, not weakness. "I'm someone who keeps a promise," Jim replied evenly, his tone neither aggressive nor fearful. "A promise to his son." The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending invisible ripples through the biker gang. Kane's expression faltered, momentarily thrown off balance. The biker with the crooked nose laughed harshly, breaking the silence. He nudged the man beside him, a burly biker with a shaved head and a thick black beard. The bearded man appeared to be in his late 30s, his heavy build and stiffened shoulders suggesting a short temper. A faint burn scar curled along his neck, perhaps a remnant of past bar fights or reckless nights. "Listen to this guy," the bearded biker said with a sneer. "Mr. Promise Keeper thinks he's the sheriff?" Rex's low growl deepened, a vibrating warning that made even the bearded man's smirk twitch. Jim moved his foot slightly, signaling the dog to hold. But Raymond couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped forward, his thin body trembling with fear, but propelled by the fragile instinct to protect a stranger who now stood in danger because of him. "Please," he whispered to Jim. "You don't need to get involved. They'll leave if I just—" His voice faded as he swallowed hard. The wrinkles on his face deepened with worry and guilt. But Jim didn't move from his stance. He glanced at Raymond, his eyes softening slightly. Then he looked back at Kane, unflinching. "He's not buying your protection," Jim said again, firmer. The room held its breath as Kane's calm exterior cracked, his jaw clenched, and he leaned in until his face was inches from Jim's. Jim did not blink. The tension built like a tightening wire, the kind that had preceded too many firefights in Jim's past. Kane cracked his knuckles slowly, deliberately, a silent message that things were about to escalate. "You just made a really stupid choice," Kane said in a low, dangerous tone. His men chuckled darkly behind him, each shifting slightly, readying themselves for whatever Kane decided. Rex stepped forward without command, muscles poised, eyes locked on Kane with a protective fierceness that only a trained German shepherd could carry. The dog's stance alone was enough to make one of the younger bikers, a thin, tattooed man with nervous eyes, take a small, involuntary step back. The biker looked barely 25, his posture tense and unsure, as though this life of intimidation was still new to him. Kane shot him a glare sharp enough to silence his hesitation. Then Kane turned his attention fully back to Jim. "One last time," Kane said coldly. "Step aside." Jim's voice dropped to a quiet, steel-edged whisper. "Not today." Every muscle in the diner seemed to freeze, even the flickering light above the counter. The confrontation had reached a point of no return, where neither side would back down. Kane's nostrils flared as he inhaled sharply, preparing to give a command his men were all too ready to execute, when the distant sound of a police siren echoed faintly through the mountain wind. It was far away, but close enough to interrupt the tension. The younger biker shifted uneasily. Kane clicked his tongue in annoyance. "This isn't over," he hissed, pointing a tattooed finger at Jim. Then he jerked his head toward the door, and the steel vipers filed out one by one, their boots pounding like rolling thunder. The diner fell eerily silent when the door closed behind them. Raymond sagged against the counter, his shoulders trembling as the adrenaline drained from him. His pale blue eyes were filled with shock and gratitude, but also fear. Fear that the bikers would return with more men. Fear for the stranger who stood up for him. Fear for what Oak Ridge might become. Jim walked to him, Rex following with calm determination. Jim placed a steady hand on the old man's shoulder. "They'll be back," Raymond whispered shakily. Jim nodded slowly. "And so will I," he said. "You're not alone anymore." Those words settled into Raymond's weary heart with the warmth of a promise fulfilled. The evening wind howled outside as the shadows lengthened. But inside Pinewood Diner, something stronger than fear took shape. A debt, a vow, a beginning. The moment the steel vipers returned, the atmosphere in Pinewood Diner thickened like storm air, pressing against a window pane. The late evening sky outside had turned a deep cobalt, rain clouds collecting over the mountaintops like a silent army. Jim Walker stood near Raymond Fisher, his military cold-weather parka still zipped high against the cold drafts sneaking through the diner windows. Raymond's frail hands trembled as he wiped down the same counter for the third time, his thin shoulders hunched under the weight of fear. Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd with powerful legs and dense black and tan fur, paced quietly between Jim and the kitchen door, his instincts already sparking. The door swung open without warning, the bell above it clanging violently. This time the steel vipers entered with less swagger and more intent. The biker at the front wasn't Kane Mercer. Instead, it was a greasy-haired man with long black strands clumped together, as if unwashed for days. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with sunken cheeks and a hooked nose that bent slightly from an old break. His eyes were yellowed at the edges, restless, twitching, telling a story of constant agitation, either from drugs or years of reckless violence. He grabbed Raymond Fisher by the wrist, yanking him forward so abruptly that the old man nearly fell. The greasy-haired biker sneered, revealing crooked teeth. "You made a mistake earlier, old man," he growled, spit flying from his lips. His grip tightened on Raymond's thin wrist, making Raymond wince with pain. Behind him, 2 more bikers entered, one tall and wiry with a jagged scar across his cheek, the other heavyset with a round gut and a shaved head. Their faces were hardened by the kind of cruelty that grows from years of preying on weaker people. The greasy-haired biker jerked Raymond again. "Kane doesn't like being told no, and now he wants to send a message." The moment the biker pulled Raymond's arm higher, Rex reacted with lightning precision. The German shepherd lunged forward across the wooden floor, muscles flexing under his coat. His growl exploded into the air just as he clamped his powerful jaws onto the man's forearm. The bite landed clean and controlled, targeting the muscle rather than the artery, proof of military-level training. The greasy-haired biker screamed, his voice cracking into a raw howl as Rex's weight forced him backward. His arm jerked violently as he tried to shake Rex off, but the dog's training held steady. Raymond stumbled backward, clutching his chest in shock. Jim moved the instant Rex did, his entire body shifting from calm to combat mode with terrifying speed. Years of training flashed into place like a switch being thrown. Jim lunged forward, grabbing the biker's wrist just above Rex's bite. His grip locked in with bone-crushing strength. Jim pivoted his weight, twisting the man's arm downward and slamming it against the nearest table in a single fluid motion. The greasy-haired biker collapsed, shrieking as Jim forced the joint to bend in a way it was never meant to. Rex released at Jim's command, falling back into a ready stance, teeth still bared. The biker with the scarred cheek roared in anger and charged at Jim from the left, raising a small folding knife he had pulled from his belt. Jim reacted instantly, not with panic, but with the precision of a man who had taught elite soldiers how to survive close-quarters combat. He blocked the incoming slash with his forearm, the thick sleeve of his parka absorbing most of the blade's force. Using his momentum, Jim drove his elbow into the attacker's jaw. A crack echoed through the diner as the biker's head snapped sideways. The man collapsed to the floor, dazed and clutching his jaw in agony. The heavyset biker, face red and twisted with rage, barreled toward Jim like a bull. His size alone was intimidating. Thick shoulders, massive chest, and arms that looked capable of crushing a steering wheel in half. Jim dropped into a lower stance, exhaling as he swept his leg sharply outward. His boot connected with the biker's shin, followed by a second swift strike behind the knee. The man's massive frame toppled like a felled tree, slamming onto the diner's wooden floor. Jim didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it at a precise angle, and stripped the weapon, a metal baton, from his grip before tossing it behind the counter. Another biker, younger than the others with a nervous face and shaved sides, attempted to swing a chain toward Jim's head. The chain whistled through the air, but Jim was faster. With a swift step to the side, Jim caught the chain mid-swing, wrapped it around the young biker's wrist, and jerked hard. The young man yelped, stumbling forward. Jim used the momentum to flip him over his shoulder, sending him crashing onto the floor next to the others. Pain radiated across the young biker's face as he groaned, clutching his twisted wrist. In less than 60 seconds, 4 bikers lay sprawled on the floor, one groaning through clenched teeth as he held his bitten arm, another unconscious from the elbow strike, the heavyset man wheezing from the sweep, and the youngest gasping for breath after the throw. Raymond Fisher stared wide-eyed, his chest heaving with fear and disbelief. Rex stood between Jim and the fallen men, posture rigid, tail stiff, ready for the next threat. The diner lights flickered softly above them, casting long shadows like battle scars across the floor. Then the front door banged open again. This time, Kane Mercer himself walked in, boots pounding with barely restrained fury. His tattooed arms tensed as he surveyed the scene, his gang defeated, his men groaning on the diner floor. His face twisted into something between shock and pure hatred. His cold eyes drifted from the injured bikers to Jim, and Jim met the glare with calm steadiness. For the first time, fear flickered in Kane's expression. He swallowed hard. "You," Kane whispered, voice dry. "You're special forces, aren't you?" Jim straightened the collar of his cold-weather parka, the movement slow, controlled. A lifetime of discipline radiated from him like invisible armor. "No," Jim said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "I'm the last friend your man's father has left." The statement was not shouted. It didn't need to be. It carried truth and finality, and it hit Kane like a punch to the gut. Kane's jaw clenched, his breath hitched. He took one step back, then another. Finally, with nothing left to say, Kane turned and bolted out the door, two uninjured bikers stumbling after him. The silence that followed was thick and trembling. Raymond Fisher leaned against a table, tears welling in his tired blue eyes, overwhelmed by fear, gratitude, and the sharp memory of the son he had lost. Jim stepped toward him slowly, Rex falling in beside him. "It's all right," Jim said softly, placing a steadying hand on Raymond's shoulder. "They won't touch you again." Outside, the night wind roared, carrying the echo of fleeing motorcycles, but inside the diner, the battle line had been drawn, and Jim, bound by a promise older than the fight itself, now stood firmly on it. The night settled heavily over Oak Ridge, laying a blanket of cold silence across the mountain town. Pinewood Diner stood under the dim glow of its flickering neon sign, the aftermath of the earlier fight still etched into the scuffed wooden floor, scattered chairs, and the soft dents where bodies had fallen. Raymond Fisher wiped the counter with trembling hands, his tired eyes glistening under the warm bulb hanging above him. Jim Walker stayed close, wearing his thick, military, cold-weather parka, zipped high against the draft, creeping through every crack of the old diner's frame. Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd, with a powerful build and alert gaze, lay curled at Jim's feet, but his ears twitched often, still on duty, even in rest. As the minutes crawled toward midnight, the fatigue of the day began to overwhelm Raymond. The thin old man, his hair silver and swept back, his wiry frame hunched from age and grief, held onto the counter for balance. Jim helped quietly, moving chairs, mopping spilled drinks, and sweeping broken glass, performing each task with deliberate calm. Raymond glanced at Jim often, as if still trying to understand why this stranger had risked everything for him. After a long silence, Raymond finally spoke. "Jim," he whispered, voice cracking, "if Michael were still alive, he'd be proud of you." His pale blue eyes shimmered with emotion. "He always talked about you in his letters, said you were the kind of man who never left anyone behind." Jim paused, leaning on the broom handle. The warm lights softened the sharp angles of his face, revealing exhaustion and a depth of sorrow rarely shown. "Michael saved me more times than I can count," he said quietly. "He was brave, stubborn as hell, but always first into the fire. I owe him more than I can ever repay." He placed a steady hand on Raymond's thin shoulder, the gesture gentle but sure. "Now it's my turn to carry his promise." Raymond's lips trembled as he wiped his eyes. "You're the only piece of him I have left," the old man whispered, voice breaking. The fragile stillness shattered with the sudden slam of the diner door. Sheriff Luis Ramirez strode inside, his boots wet from the chilly night rain. Ramirez, a man in his early 50s with broad shoulders, graying beard stubble, and deep-set eyes that had seen too much, carried the hardened weariness of someone who had survived a lifetime of violent confrontations. His brown sheriff's jacket was soaked at the shoulders, and his hand hovered near his holster, not out of aggression but ingrained vigilance. Jim tensed immediately. Rex rose to his feet, standing between Jim and Raymond like a sentinel. Ramirez raised a calming hand. "Easy, folks. I'm not here for trouble." Ramirez stepped nearer, his tired eyes scanning the damaged diner. "Hell of a mess you got here," he muttered, running a hand over his short salt and pepper hair. The sheriff's voice was usually firm and composed, but tonight it trembled with something else. Urgency. Maybe even fear. "Jim Walker, right?" he asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Jim nodded. Ramirez exhaled, rubbing his jaw as if preparing to deliver a blow neither of them would like. "We've got a situation," he said. "And by situation, I mean something big." Raymond stepped forward nervously, wringing his hands. "Sheriff, are they coming back?" Ramirez hesitated, which made the answer obvious. "Kane Mercer didn't just run to lick his wounds," Ramirez said. "He regrouped, and now he's calling in the other chapters of the Steel Vipers." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Our scanners picked up chatter. He's gathering 20, maybe more, some from 2 towns over. They're planning to ride in at dawn." His dark eyes turned toward Jim, full of worry, yet tempered by reluctant admiration. "Kane wants revenge, and he wants you." Raymond staggered back, his frail frame shaking. No. "This can't be happening," he whispered. His face turned pale, and he gripped the counter as if the wood could anchor him. Jim moved toward him instantly, steadying him with one hand, as Rex pressed close to Raymond's leg with quiet reassurance. Jim looked at Ramirez. "How long do we have?" "A few hours at best," the sheriff replied. "My deputies can be here, but not enough to hold off 20 bikers armed with God knows what." His voice dropped. "I'm sorry, Jim, but this is bigger than anything we're used to." Jim's expression didn't shift. Not fear, not anger, only a solemn resolve. His voice remained calm. "I'll be here," he said. "I made a promise." Ramirez stared at Jim for several seconds, trying to find the right words. "You're just one man," he said quietly. "Even with your skills, you can't fight an army alone." Jim glanced at Raymond, then down at Rex, whose posture remained steady and ready. "I'm not alone," Jim said, "and defending one old man's life is worth standing my ground." Sheriff Ramirez sighed heavily, the sound worn and conflicted. "Damn it, Jim," he muttered. "Sometimes I think men like you don't know how to walk away." Jim almost smiled, but it was a sad one. "Men like me only walk toward the things that matter," Jim replied. Ramirez swallowed hard, torn between duty and understanding. "All right," he finally said, "but at least let me position a few cruisers nearby, and I'll call in the state patrol. Maybe they'll send someone before sunrise." Jim nodded in gratitude. "Thank you, Sheriff." Ramirez turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "You're risking your life for a man who isn't even kin," he said softly. Jim answered without hesitation. "He is, not by blood, but by battlefield." After Ramirez left, the diner felt colder, as if the wind outside had seeped into the walls. Raymond sat heavily at one of the booths, burying his face in his trembling hands. Jim sat across from him, Rex lying between them. "Jim?" "You should run," Raymond whispered, voice thick with fear. "They'll kill you. I'm just an old man. I'm not worth—" Jim stopped him with a raised hand. "Michael would say otherwise," Jim said. "He gave his last breath to protect others. Now I give mine for him." Raymond's tears fell silently. The old man whispered, "I don't deserve this." Jim placed a firm hand over Raymond's. "You deserve peace, and tomorrow I'll fight for it." Jim spent the next hour checking doors, scouting exits, and reviewing the diner's layout with military efficiency. He examined the angles, potential cover points, and blind spots, habits burned into him from years training elite soldiers. Raymond watched quietly, somehow comforted by Jim's meticulous preparation. Rex followed Jim's every step, pausing to sniff corners and door frames, tail stiff with anticipation. Jim spoke softly to the dog. "You remember the drills?" he murmured. Rex responded with a low rumble. "Ready." By 2 a.m., exhaustion pulled heavily at Raymond's frail body. Jim led him upstairs to the small room above the diner. Raymond's home full of framed photos of Michael Fisher, each showing a young man with sandy hair, bright eyes, and a grin full of life. Raymond paused at one picture where Michael, dressed in uniform, hugged him tightly before deployment. Jim rested a hand on Raymond's back. "He loved you more than anything," Jim said quietly. Raymond nodded, tears streaking down his cheeks. Then live, Jim," he whispered shakily. "No matter what happens tomorrow, live, for both of you." Jim didn't answer. But his silence was a promise, forged deeper than steel. The cold dawn crept over Oak Ridge like a hesitant breath, brushing pale light across the quiet streets and the frost-coated windows of Pinewood Diner. Jim Walker stood alone outside the building, the collar of his military cold-weather parka raised high against the bitter wind. His boots planted firmly on the gravel, he scanned the empty road with the calm focus of a man who had survived too many sunrises on too many battlefields. Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd, stood at his left side, tail low, ears alert, eyes fixed on the horizon. Inside the diner, Raymond Fisher rested his trembling hands on a mug of untouched coffee, eyes still swollen from a night without sleep. Kane Mercer and his army of bikers could arrive at any moment. Jim knew they would be outnumbered. He also knew he had no intention of leaving. Still, Jim pulled out his old military phone, a device scratched and dented but nearly indestructible. His thumbs hesitated for a moment, then typed a short message into the group chat used by his former unit and trainees. "Michael's father is in danger. I need you." That was all he sent. No explanations. No details. Men like them didn't need paragraphs. They understood danger the way others understood weather. By instinct, by scars, by the heavy air before a storm. Jim put the phone back into his pocket, adjusting the zipper of his parka. The wind howled through the mountains, carrying the quiet threat of the day ahead. 5 minutes later, Jim's phone vibrated once, then again, and again. He checked the screen. The replies came fast and sharp. "On my way. 30 minutes out. Tell the old man he won't stand alone." "We got you, brother." Jim's jaw tightened as he read each message. Some names on the screen belonged to men he had trained years ago, men with haunted eyes who had lost too much of themselves in dusty deserts far from home. Others were fellow soldiers from Michael Fisher's old squad, bonded by blood spilled in the same war. These were men who had once carved promises into the dirt with combat knives, vowing to protect each other's families if one of them fell. Today, those promises were being called in. By the time the sky turned from navy blue to ash gray, the first vehicle arrived. A dusty tan pickup with a cracked windshield and mismatched tires. From it stepped Sergeant Dean Hartley, a stocky man in his late 40s with a heavy beard, a weathered face, and forearms like tree trunks. His left ear was partially missing, a reminder of a roadside bomb that should have killed him. He walked toward Jim with a steady limp, the kind that years of pain could not fully hide. "Heard you needed a wall," Dean said, voice rough but warm. Jim clasped his forearm in greeting. "I need brothers," he answered. Dean grinned faintly. "Good, because more are coming." Soon the diner's parking lot filled with the rumble of engines, boots crunching on gravel, and the unmistakable presence of men shaped by war. 17 veterans arrived in total, each carrying his own history etched across his body. There was Tyler Briggs, an African-American former medic in his mid-30s, with calm, steady hands and tired eyes that had seen too many final breaths. There was Miguel Alvarez, a wiry sniper with tattoos of the Virgin Mary down his arm, his dark hair tied back, and a rosary hanging from his neck. And there was Eli Raymond, a tall, scarred man with a missing finger and a gaze sharp enough to slice steel, who had once been one of Jim's best trainees. Among the group were men who still carried pieces of their uniforms, faded patches, worn jackets, dusty boots polished only by memory. Some wore civilian clothes, but all carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of soldiers. They lined up instinctively, forming a row in front of the diner as if responding to a silent drill command. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The sound of their synchronized steps on the frozen ground was louder than any war cry. Jim walked along the line, greeting each man with a handshake, a nod, or a clasp of shoulders. Rex trotted beside him, sniffing boots and observing faces, recognizing the familiar scent of discipline and adrenaline. Raymond Fisher stepped outside, leaning on the doorframe for support. His thin frame looked impossibly small compared to the 17 veterans standing shoulder to shoulder before him. His eyes widened, tears forming instantly as he looked at the unlikely army gathered for him. "Oh, Michael," he whispered, voice breaking. "Your friends, they kept their word." His gaze drifted from one hardened face to another, overwhelmed by the sight of so many men who had survived the same chaos his son never returned from. Dean Hartley stepped forward, removing his knit cap in respect. "Sir," he said softly, "your boy saved a lot of us. Today's our turn." Jim watched Raymond crumble into quiet sobs, the grief pouring out of him more gently than before. It wasn't just sorrow. It was pride and relief, and the kind of gratitude that could break a man's heart open. Jim supported the old man by the elbow and guided him to a chair outside the diner so he could watch the men forming a defensive perimeter. The sun had barely risen, but already the veterans had divided into groups, 2 checking roof access, 3 walking the perimeter fence, 1 mapping out cover positions behind parked cars. Miguel Alvarez studied sight lines with the calm precision of an experienced marksman. Tyler Briggs evaluated first aid supplies, as if preparing for a battlefield triage zone. Eli Raymond approached Jim with a grim expression, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "Kane Mercer's not just angry," he said. "He's unstable. Word is he's been spiraling since his brother died last year. Guy's desperate to prove something." Jim nodded. The pieces fit too well. A man with nothing to lose was the most dangerous kind. "We hold the line," Jim said. "We don't escalate." Eli smirked faintly. "You always did love impossible rules." Then he looked upward at the pale sky. "They'll come soon." Rex growled low at the same moment, sensing the tension spreading through the air. As the preparations continued, the veterans moved with silent efficiency. Some even cracked tired jokes to soften the dread hanging over the group, though their laughter never reached their eyes. They were soldiers who had tasted death enough times to recognize when it was nearby, but this time felt different. They weren't fighting for a country, or a mission briefing, or a faceless directive. They were fighting for a promise, for a fallen brother, for an old man who had already lost too much. The men took their positions with unspoken reverence for the cause they now protected. Raymond looked at Jim with fragile hope. Why would they come for someone like me?" he asked quietly. Jim knelt beside him, resting one steady hand on the old man's shoulder. "Because you gave this world a good man," Jim replied, "and men like Michael don't die alone. They leave behind people who loved them, people they saved, people who owe them everything." Raymond covered his face as tears flowed again. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Jim shook his head gently. "You deserve peace, and we're here to make sure you finally get it." The veterans stood in formation once more, the morning light touching their faces as if blessing them for what was coming. Jim stepped forward, Rex at his side, and took his place at the front of the line. The cold wind snapped against his parka, but he didn't move. The mountains echoed in the distance, carrying the faint vibration of engines still far away, but approaching. Jim whispered softly to himself, to Michael, to the memory of all the fallen. Brothers never leave each other behind. And as the sun broke over the horizon, the 17 veterans closed ranks, ready to face whatever darkness was coming. The roar of engines shattered the calm mountain morning as more than 20 motorcycles descended into Oak Ridge like a rolling storm front. The Steel Vipers came in a tight formation, led by the menacing figure of Kane Mercer, a towering brute in his mid-40s with a shaved head, thick beard, and leather vest stretched across tattooed muscles. His expression twisted with unchecked fury, still nursing humiliation from the previous day. The bikes formed a semicircle around Pinewood Diner, engines thundering like drums of war. Inside the diner, mugs rattled on their hooks. Outside, dust spiraled through the cold morning air, blown by the arrival of violence. Jim Walker stepped forward onto the pavement, the gravel crunching under his boots. His military cold-weather parka rustled in the mountain wind, its collar high around his angular jaw and weathered face. His intense blue eyes never left the enemy line. Beside him walked Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat bristled with tension, ears sharp and nose lifted to the scent of danger. Behind Jim, 17 veterans formed a united wall. Their faces bore scars, wrinkles, and the weight of wars fought far from Oak Ridge. Some crossed their arms, others stood with hands loosely at their sides, ready. Kane Mercer removed his helmet with a violent motion, his eyes bloodshot from rage and a sleepless night. The memory of being overpowered by Jim haunted him, feeding a bruised ego that had been festering for years. Kane had always used fear as a weapon, especially since a traumatic bar brawl in his 20s left him with a broken jaw and the belief that respect only came from domination. He stepped forward, boots thumping against the asphalt, and yelled with all the force his pride could muster, "Jim Walker, get out here!" His voice bounced off buildings and windows across the street. Jim stood firm in front of Pinewood Diner, not taking a single step back. Rex stood glued to Jim's leg, eyes locked on Kane, growling low. The veterans lined up behind Jim were a stark contrast to the raucous bikers. Calm, disciplined, stoic. Sergeant Dean Hartley stood at Jim's right, broad-shouldered and unshaken, his half-missing ear catching the morning light. Miguel Alvarez rested a hand on a rosary tucked inside his jacket, and Eli Raymond scanned rooftops and alleys with the habit of a lifelong recon specialist. Their silence alone was intimidating, an army without needing to speak. Raymond Fisher pushed open the diner door with trembling hands. At 68, with long silver hair and a thin frame, he looked fragile in his red flannel shirt. But his eyes carried years of grief and the unbearable weight of losing a son. He stepped beside Jim, though Jim immediately shifted to shield the old man with his body. Raymond whispered, "Jim, you don't have to risk yourself like this." But Jim kept his gaze steady forward. "Michael saved my life more times than I can count," Jim replied quietly. "I stand here because he can't." The words tightened Raymond's throat. Kane laughed, the sound dripping with arrogance. He slapped his chest and shouted, "You think this little veteran reunion scares us? We outnumber you, 20 to barely a handful." His men laughed with him, some revving engines, others cracking their knuckles or gripping brass knuckles, knives, and chains. Among them stood a tall blonde biker named Ridge Dalton, newly introduced to the gang. Ridge was lanky but wiry, with a long scar slicing across his chin and bright, unhinged eyes. Eyes that once belonged to an amateur boxer whose career ended after a brutal knockout. Violence had become his substitute for purpose. Before Jim could answer Kane, a deep voice rose behind the veterans. "Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched." Sheriff Ignacio Ramirez arrived with 10 county deputies. Ramirez, a broad Latino man in his early 50s, with graying hair at the temples and a thick mustache, stepped into view. Years of dealing with violent felons had hardened his features, but his eyes still held empathy for his town. Behind him rolled 2 armored SUVs, marked with the emblem of the Oregon Tactical Response Unit. A dozen SWAT officers climbed out, each armed, armored, and ready. The sight froze the steel vipers. Kane's bravado flickered for a moment, and he looked around as if counting possible escape routes. But Ramirez raised a commanding hand. "Kane Mercer," he announced with authority, "you and your gang are under investigation for extortion, assault, destruction of property, and organized criminal activity." His deputies fanned out, blocking the street behind the bikers. SWAT took positions on rooftops and behind vehicles, creating an iron ring. The entire town of Oak Ridge seemed to hold its breath. Kane spat onto the pavement, but anger couldn't mask the fear creeping into his eyes. He stepped closer to Jim, lowering his voice to a threatening growl. "You did this, you and your mutt." Rex growled louder, muscles tensed. Jim remained unmoved. "Raymond Fisher is the father of a fallen hero," Jim said, voice cold as steel. "You will not touch him again." The veterans behind him nodded, no hesitation in their posture. The unity alone spoke louder than any threat. Kane's mask finally cracked, his jaw clenched, and frustration boiled over as he threw his helmet to the ground. "Screw this! Pull out!" he barked to his crew. Several bikers tried to start their engines, but immediately the deputies and SWAT closed in. "No one leaves," Sheriff Ramirez declared. Officers surrounded the gang from all sides. Some bikers dropped weapons and lifted their hands. Others cursed until they were pinned down. Ridge Dalton tried to flee on foot, but Rex lunged, barking thunderously, forcing him to freeze. One by one, handcuffs clicked shut. Deputies pressed the steel vipers against squad cars, reading them their rights. Kane was the last to be restrained, screaming curses as 2 SWAT officers locked his wrists in steel. Sheriff Ramirez approached Jim, removing his hat respectfully. "You bought us time yesterday," he said. "You gave us a chance to prepare." Jim nodded, exhaustion settling in. Raymond Fisher watched with tears in his eyes as the terror that haunted him was dismantled in front of his diner. For the first time in years, he felt safe. When the last biker was taken away, Oak Ridge fell silent. The veterans slowly relaxed, although none lowered their guard fully. Jim placed a hand on Rex's head, praising the dog softly. Raymond Fisher approached Jim and rested a shaking hand on his shoulder. "Jim, Michael would be proud of you today." Jim swallowed hard, looking down at the pavement where the helmet still lay. "I only kept a promise," he said quietly. But deep inside, he felt the presence of a fallen brother standing beside him. The weeks following the confrontation brought a quiet Oak Ridge had not felt in years. Pinewood Diner, once shadowed by fear, now carried a soft calm that settled like morning fog. Locals returned in steady numbers: teachers, truckers, loggers, families, each grateful for the safety reclaimed. Jim Walker continued to arrive early, wearing his military cold-weather parka, hands rough from both war and years on the road. Raymond Fisher, now more relaxed, moved between tables with renewed steadiness despite his thin frame and silver hair. Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd, stretched under the old pine tree near the entrance every morning, the sunlight warming his black and tan coat. The diner felt alive again, its walls echoing low conversations instead of whispered fears. Several business owners who had once lived under the gang's shadow stepped forward to testify. Many were older men, small-town shopkeepers with weathered faces shaped by years of struggle. Among them was Harold Jennings, a mechanic in his late 50s with deep creases across his forehead and grease-stained fingers, always wearing a brown work jacket. There was also Linda Weaver, a thin, stern woman in her 40s with sharp cheekbones, curly brown hair tied tightly, and the stubborn resilience of someone who raised 3 children alone. Each described how Kane Mercer and his men had threatened them, broken windows, damaged property, and demanded weekly payments. Their bravery added weight to the case, finally cutting the Steel Viper's influence from the community. Prosecutors from the county and the state moved quickly, forming a joint task force to dismantle every trace of the gang's operations. Detective Aaron Cole, a tall black officer in his mid-30s with a shaved head and thoughtful eyes, became the lead investigator. He had a reputation for patience and precision, shaped by surviving a near-fatal shooting early in his career that left a faint scar across his left cheek. He drove out to Pinewood Diner several times to speak with Jim, Raymond, and the veterans who had stood on the front line. Each meeting carried an air of respect, as Cole's calm professionalism complemented Jim's steady military presence. On a cool morning, Raymond Fisher placed 2 mugs of steaming coffee on the counter and motioned Jim to sit. The elderly man's hands still shook slightly, a result of grief and age, but strength had returned to his posture. His red flannel shirt looked brighter than it had in months. Raymond walked around the counter, embracing Jim with a long, silent hug. "Michael would be proud of you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "My boy always said you were the one man he could trust with his life." Jim swallowed hard, the memory of the battlefield in Afghanistan briefly pulling shadows across his face. He replied softly, "He saved me more times than I can count. I'm just returning what I owe." Rex padded across the wooden floor, nose twitching, as he inspected newly repainted table legs. Jim watched him with a faint smile. The dog had grown calmer these days, though the sharp, alert intelligence in his amber eyes remained ever present. Rex had been just a young pup when Jim rescued him from a bombed-out village years ago. The dog's loyalty was forged in fire, through explosions, desert storms, and nights when Jim had no one else. "If not for Rex," Jim said, his voice low, "and if not for Michael giving his life that day, I wouldn't be here." The words hung in the air like a confession from deep within a soldier's soul. Raymond sat beside him at a corner booth, looking out the window towards the tall pines swaying in the breeze. "Michael didn't die for nothing," he said. "He believed in something bigger. Brotherhood, duty, love for his team." Raymond's thin fingers brushed the edge of the tabletop. And that love kept you alive. It brought you back to Oak Ridge. It brought all those veterans here when we needed them." His smile was warm, gentle, and proud. Though his wrinkles told a story of heartbreak, his eyes carried the quiet redemption of a man who had regained hope. Later that week, the veterans gathered one last time at the diner before dispersing back to their own states, jobs, and lives. Dean Hartley, the heavy-set veteran with the missing half ear, hugged Jim with the strength of 2 decades of shared battles. Miguel Alvarez left behind a small wooden cross carved with the letters MF, honoring Michael Fisher. Eli Raymond gave Jim a firm handshake and told him, "If Oak Ridge ever needs us again, just make one call." Among them was also a younger veteran, Thomas Reed, around 27, slender, pale-skinned, and soft-spoken, who had joined late after hearing what happened. Thomas carried a prosthetic lower leg hidden beneath his jeans, the result of an IED explosion that also took 2 of his closest friends. His quiet courage added another layer of meaning to the gathering. When the last truck pulled away, Jim stood alone outside the diner, the early dusk painting the sky gold. Rex sat beside him, leaning his weight comfortably against Jim's leg. Jim picked up a photo Raymond had given him minutes earlier. The picture showed a smiling young soldier, Michael Fisher, muscular, brown-eyed, messy dark hair, holding an M4 rifle with Jim standing behind him. They were covered in dust and sweat, but their smiles were genuine. Jim traced Michael's face with a gloved thumb, remembering the promise made during the soldier's final breath. A week later, Pinewood Diner held a charity dinner honoring all veterans who had protected the town. Townspeople filled the small space, teachers, teenagers, elderly couples, families, all eager to say thank you. Sheriff Ramirez, wearing his brown uniform freshly pressed, gave a speech honoring the brotherhood that saved Oak Ridge. Detective Cole spoke about justice, fairness, and the power of ordinary people standing together. Jim stood near the back, uncomfortable with attention, but people approached him with warm handshakes and heartfelt gratitude. Raymond watched with pride, his smile persistent through the entire evening. Toward the end of the night, Raymond asked Jim to follow him to the kitchen. Raymond opened an old wooden box, hands trembling lightly. Inside was a silver dog tag engraved with Michael Fisher, USMC. Raymond placed it into Jim's calloused hand, tears gathering in the lines of his face. "This belongs to you now. You carried his legacy into battle one last time." Jim bowed his head, overwhelmed by emotion he had buried for years, and whispered, "I'll guard it as I guarded him." Rex sat beside them quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. As the evening drew to a close, Raymond walked Jim outside. Oak Ridge was peaceful, lit by warm porch lights and the glow of street lamps reflecting off the pavement. Snowflakes fluttered down softly, the first of the season. Raymond took a long breath and said, "Michael is gone, but the bond he shared with you, that never died. Brotherhood doesn't end with death." Jim nodded, watching the snow gather on Rex's fur. In the silence, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Closure. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of peace. In the quiet peace returning to Pinewood Diner, Jim Walker understood that a warrior may leave the battlefield, but a promise made to someone who has fallen never fades. And sometimes, God sends quiet miracles, like Rex, the loyal dog who never leaves his side, or the good people who continue protecting one another every single day. In a world filled with challenges, God always places opportunities before us to choose what is right. If this story touched your heart, please share, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless you and your family with protection and peace.